I've been talking for quite some time about the container for working with difficult emotions, cultivating qualities of ease and happiness and awareness that can actually be substantial enough and strong enough to hold some of these difficult spaces. And so everything that we're doing is really held in that kind of an awareness. Otherwise, if we kind of plop into the middle of difficult emotions, they can kind of sweep us away and become too overwhelming. But I want to begin tonight to touch into some of the specific difficulties that we might encounter in our mind and body and how to work with them. Because otherwise, the practice can easily take on a flavor of trying to get rid of some of these energies, which is not quite doable. And so we can be really confused about how to navigate them. So I wanted to, over a period of time, really work with some of these difficult emotions. And I wanted to start with shame and self-criticism because they're so ubiquitous. There's so much, that we can have shame and self-criticism about all the other difficult emotions. And so to kind of, again, have that be a part of the container, if we understand a little bit more clearly how to work with them and what they're there for and what they're useful for, that it can actually give us some guidance about how to work not only with the shame and self-criticism, but with all the other emotions as well. And as those of you know who have heard some of the earlier talks, much of this is couched in the sense of really kind of holding a vision of what we're about in our practice. Our practice is about freedom from suffering. And I've done a couple talks now on that phrase of the Metta Sutta has just been kind of reverberating for me, that phrase that says, "So with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings," and this sense of cultivating a boundless heart is just it feels like cheesecake or chocolate ice cream or something like that. It just feels like such a delicious quality. So with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. And the Buddha in the Metta Sutta says this is what should be done. He says, cultivate this quality of a boundless heart. And so I wanted to talk about cultivating a quality of boundless heart tonight with respect to ourselves, which is really where the seeds are planted. I'll talk more about that later. I found this quote from Geshe Langri Tangpa, who is a 12th century rather famous Tibetan teacher. And he offered this as a kind of loving kindness practice. May I consider my being precious. May I always respect myself. May I face my inner darkness and investigate its intention and how to turn it to wholeness and healing for myself. May I be moved with compassion for all pain. When I am hurt by others, may I care for myself without retaliation. May I know all difficulty as sacred teacher. May I offer joy to myself. May I be free from self-centered ego concerns of loss and gain. So kind of a different version, if you will, of this loving kindness practice, where he's inviting us to cultivate the capacity to hold our own being precious. And to cultivate a boundless heart with respect to our own being. And so the challenge, I think, in all of these difficult emotions is to see the arisings, whether it's desire, fear, anger, sadness, joy, whatever it is, to see the arisings that can manifest in unwholesome ways, and to learn first to navigate their energies in wholesome ways. It requires learning to recognize what's unwholesome in its manifestation and to not either indulge in these arisings, kind of dive into the middle of them, or try to get rid of them, repress them, try to ignore their arisings. So again, sort of like the middle way that the Buddha invites us over and over to cultivate. So can we, in this boundless heart, it was the last piece of the guided meditation, can we see these arisings as just part of the arisings of our human beingness, that we then kind of amplify and distort through all kinds of conditioning. But they're basically just arisings of our human beingness. Can we see these arisings and cultivate the capacity to navigate them in wholesome ways without indulging in them, acting them out in ways that are harmful, or repressing them and twisting ourselves into pretzels as we try to not have certain qualities of our human beings. Ultimately, cultivating the capacity to have full release so that we can just see them, and we just see them as this is what's happening. It's the path that the Buddha took. Even the Buddha, certainly on the night of his awakening, when Mara came and challenged him with all sorts of unwholesome kinds of energies arising, the Buddha just simply said, "I know you. I know you. I see you. I know you." So can we know these experiences? Can we know them and allow them to pass? And the Buddha in this way is teaching us a step in human evolution. You've heard me speak of this before, that as humans, we have evolved over many years, millions of years. I looked it up. The first human ancestors appeared between 5 million and 7 million years ago. They were making stone tools by 2.5 million years ago. Most scientists think that people who look like us, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, evolved by at least 130,000 years ago. And maybe about 40,000 years ago became humans. Human beings evolved in the way that we kind of recognize today. And when you think that the Buddha taught 2,500 years ago in relation to 40,000 years ago, it's not very long, And so he's really teaching us a step in our human evolution, that we don't have to be enslaved by these, if you will, animal energies that arise. At the same time, we don't have to pretend that they're not there. But really, it's just a step in our evolution. And that's what our spiritual practice is about, is like, how do we keep unfolding? How do we keep moving in these ways so that we're not victims, if you will, of these energies? How do we develop as fully human? So our question in terms of, what are emotions? What does it mean for an emotion to be unwholesome? I asked you that question. I asked you about, what is wholesome, what is unwholesome, quite a few weeks ago. Especially when many of the most basic emotions are seen to be genetically wired in. Anger is genetically wired in. Even shame is genetically wired in. Anxiety, genetically wired in. So there are certain qualities of emotion that are really just part of our human nature. So it's important to understand how to use our spiritual practice in much the same way that the Buddha did. In the time of the Buddha, the austere practitioners, the ones that he sat with for a while, used their practice to try to sit on, shut down, or repress our natural human experience. That's what led the Buddha to be eating 1 grain of rice a day. that somehow the challenge was to deny the physical body and mind, to kind of collapse around it and just keep the austere practices. Or the alternative then was to indulge in these energies. To just say, well, they're here, and so we can just act them out and be greedy and lustful and angry and harmful in whatever ways we want. And so the Buddha's great teaching was to help us, see, there's a middle path that's neither sitting on, repressing, or shutting down, and not indulging. So we're in good company as we ask these sorts of questions. So, shame and self-criticism. I want to take just a very brief excursion into the biology and maybe some of the psychology of shame, because it can be helpful, I think, to understand the more normal, if you will, human arising of it, and to some extent also why we in the Western world and maybe in the United States have a particularly hard time with it. So shame is a painful feeling caused by injury to one's sense of self and or injury to one's sense of social belonging. All primary emotions have some positive function, at least in terms of our evolutionary history. And shame is invoked when there's some interpersonal threat or threat to our social belonging. Shame is sort of a mechanism in which we don't do what is not acceptable to our tribe. We learn to kind of not do that, whatever that thing is. And our tribe can actually have lots of different views about what's acceptable or not. And we can consider our families as our tribes, or our Western culture or our communities as our tribes. But let's take our families for a minute, because that maybe is where a lot of us get snagged. That in our families, there can be all sorts of energies that arise that are not acceptable for some particular reason. And those energies could be anger is not acceptable, could be high energy, could be anxiety, could be joy, could be sadness, could be happiness, could be being slow, could be being fast, it could be, a lot of things. But that if the tribe has certain standards about what is acceptable or not, and imposes those standards, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, imposes those standards in certain ways, what tends to happen is the energy of that arising gets contracted into the physical body. I'll give you a little example. I have a little dance I do sometimes about this. So it'd be something like, if the energy, let's take for example the energy of joy. You have a 2-year-old who's very kind of rambunctious and energetic, and so there's this little 2-year-old who's kind of full of himself in the yard or in the house, or more likely in the kitchen while somebody's cooking dinner or something like that. And so that there's this kind of energetic quality, and that when that energy is met with some kind of shutdown, like, you stop it, sit down, be quiet, and whatever the energy is, anger, fear, whatever, sadness. You've heard me say that. I heard one time I was walking on the downtown mall, and I was passing a little boy walking with his mother, and he said, "I'm cold." And she said, "No, you're not." So now his sense of "I'm cold" gets shut down. What tends to happen biologically when that happens is that our bodies contract. And we start to hold the energy of that experience physically in our physical bodies. And it starts to look like this. And that the quality of shame is basically saying to our tribe, okay, I won't be like that. And that shame has a kind of very characteristic physical manifestation, in our physical bodies. And it's biologically, it's just a mechanism for kind of keeping us attached to our tribe by not manifesting whatever the energy is that's unacceptable at that particular moment. So it's useful to kind of understand that about shame in particular, because working with shame, if we want to unwind shame, it really requires working with the physical body. And those of us who've worked with shame, either emotionally or psychologically, or verbally, conceptually, read self-help books, it really isn't going to help much other than to kind of give a frame for the work that needs to be done, a way of understanding it. But that really something like body work, to really kind of help release the holding patterns, or qigong, or tai chi, or something that involves some kind of energetic movement of the energy, and releasing that kind of energy, so that we can reconnect again with the basic, the whatever the basic energy is that's been shut down, so that so that energy that gets kind of collapsed and contracted. There's actually quite a lot I could say about this, but I don't want to go too far into the psychology. So what I've done, I have a fairly long essay that I've posted on my own website. It's not on the IMCC website. It's on my own personal website, which is sharonbb.org. Not hard to remember. And it's the last posting, and it's a posting that's about what I call ruptures, which are the places where our experience is not attuned to by important others, and that we learn to kind of collapse ourselves and shut down. So it's a little bit of background about ruptures and the importance of attunement. And I have a personal theory, I don't know if it has any validity at all, but I have a personal theory. Tsoknyi Rinpoche says self-criticism is a disease of the West. My personal theory is that in the West we have impairments in our capacity to attune to children, and therefore to one another. And these lacks of the deficits, if you will, in attunement really lead to this kind of quality of shutting ourselves down in certain ways, and then self-criticism comes in to kind of facilitate that process. Then we start to criticize ourselves for A, having the energy to begin with, whatever that energy is that's been deemed unacceptable, and B, for having shame, and then we become ashamed of our shame, and ashamed of the shame about our shame, and ashamed of the shame about the shame of our shame. And so it just kind of keeps compounding with that quality of criticism. And, as an effort to kind of say, well, stop it. Stop having that contraction, stop feeling shut down, stop feeling, confused about your, whatever it is, anger, anxiety, happiness, sadness, whatever. Stop being confused about that, which isn't quite doable in that way. And I think in our Western culture that we have a tendency to try to do that without attunement. And the essay is really about attunement and breaks in attunement and how that can affect us. So I thought rather than trying to talk about it here, that I would just post that essay if anybody wants to read that or see a little bit further. It talks about ruptures. It talks about, what else? Repair. It talks about attunement, The importance of attunement talks about ruptures in attunement, talks about repair, and talks about how the Dharma really touches into that some. So you can kind of see, I think, a little bit more of the just sort of the process through which this shame develops. So neurobiologically, this shame, this kind of contracted state, becomes established when some expression is met with indifference or criticism, hostility or blame, especially when there is a status or power differential. And in the essay, it goes through kind of a sequence. I named 6 or 8 different kinds of shutdowns, from fairly benign, your mommy is cooking dinner and, or is on the telephone and little girl says, "Mommy, mommy, 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 mommy," and she says, "Honey, wait a minute. That's a fairly benign rupture. It's like, where her own energy isn't able to be met, but then mommy hangs up the phone, comes back, repairs the rupture, says, "Okay, honey, sorry, I was busy. Now, what is it?" So it's the unrepaired ruptures that are the problem. Ruptures happen actually all the time, but ideally those ruptures are repaired. And in our Western culture, my personal theory is that a lot of times those ruptures are not repaired, and that then becomes the problem, so that we end up kind of carrying the energy of all of those shutdowns, especially when there are power differentials. And sometimes some of those ruptures can be toxic, in the sense where somebody really loses control. We see that sometimes when we're out, shopping or something, or somebody is like vigorously, assaulting a child and really, shutting that down, and we're pretty sure that the repair is not going to happen when it goes home. But even those can be repaired, but they need to be repaired. So anyway, there's a little bit, actually a good bit more on that if you want to read about that. So shame arises primarily when there are toxic ruptures, especially when there's a power differential, and when those ruptures are not repaired. So when there's no way for the energy then to move. If, for example, a little kid is running into the street and the parent screams, "Stop right now!" Okay. And then the parent comes over and says, "Honey, oh my goodness, you scared the daylights out of me." And kind of repairs the rupture, letting the energy move. There's nothing wrong with what you were doing, with the possible exception you were about to get hit by a car. But there was nothing wrong with the energy. So so being able to repair it, letting that energy move through. Energy that doesn't move through is a recipe for shame. Biology, animals experience that kind of shutdown in much the same way. How animals do it, by the way, is when the crisis is over, when the lion has given up and isn't chasing the antelope anymore, how the animal gets rid of it is that they kind of do this sort of thing. Sometimes you'll see that if you kind of have an animal that you capture and you hold it, and you'll put it down, and the bird will kind of do this kind of fluffy thing, and that's them shaking out the energy, recalibrating the nervous system. So to be able to recalibrate in the moment is the antidote to shame in the moment. To be able to unwind it in the body, if it's been held there for a long time, is the antidote to shame. So I think it's important to understand about shame, because otherwise we then tend to kind of add self-criticism to the top of it. Because shame doesn't feel good, This kind of collapsed, contracted, shame actually tends to be held in a kind of freeze position. If one can activate their energy, we can either cry out, we can fight, or we can flee. All of those involve some kind of movement of the energy. But if it's shut down and we're in freeze, it's not activated. And that then, we kind of when we're kind of caught in that, and then when it arises in some other circumstance, or we can't feel in our bodies, or whatever it is, then we tend to judge ourselves for that kind of contraction, because it feels bad and it's not terribly effective in how we work in real life. So shame first starts externally, that energy is shut down, and then we internalize it. And then as we grow, we can add, as I said, we can add our own mental formations to it, our own thoughts about it. Our own thoughts about the experience of shame, and also our own thoughts about the badness of whatever the energy is that was trying to manifest. So people can be, that little boy, you think that little boy is going to have a little bit of difficulty navigating his own internal sense of his body, whether or not he's cold or hot. First I have to check with my mother to see how I feel, because I can't read it myself anymore. So our own kind of capacity for discernment gets a little diminished in those ways. And then we make judgments about what is or is not acceptable. And those judgments tend to shut us down still further, complicating it still further. So we get farther and farther away from a boundless heart. So here's a place, though, that the teachings can be misunderstood. When we talk about working with difficult feelings, we can kind of import our sense of needing to shut certain experiences down right into our spiritual practice, and hear the teachings as saying just that. That really anger's bad, fear's bad, joy's bad, whatever. So that we really need to kind of pay attention to how we're hearing the spiritual teachings. And we can imagine that, in our own unworthiness and inadequacy, that even though we should develop a boundless heart, we ourselves are not capable. We're unworthy. We're really not capable of it, and we're certainly not capable of receiving that kind of care for ourselves because we are so defective and inadequate. So it can kind of, even our spiritual practice can kind of be imported in the service of shame and self-criticism. So we have to really be careful about that and remember that, Langri Tangpa talked about, may I consider my being precious. That's the teaching. That's the teaching. May I always respect myself. May I offer joy to myself. All of those qualities. That's the teaching. And so if we're somehow not connected to that, we're misunderstanding the teachings. So it's helpful to discern when we're out of balance. But again, the challenge is to be to notice the difference between discernment, seeing clearly, and that place where that discernment turns into criticism, into self-criticism, judgment. I've read to you before the Ajahn Suchito outlines the voice of criticism, which is a voice that drives but doesn't nourish, that sets unattainable goals or timelines, that thinks in absolutes like shoulds or never or always, that offers recrimination for mistakes instead of curiosity, a general mood that sees without a boundless heart, without love or grace. And he says, didn't quite make it and not likely to. That voice that is, it's on the edge of discernment. It's seeing something that isn't quite working in a wholesome way, but then adds that kind of clunk on top of it. And so the discernment is fine. If I see something, I can't quite see how to navigate this. But the criticism is just kind of falling back into the same hole. And the Buddha actually didn't really know about self-hatred. It's always shocking to me to think about the Buddha not knowing something. And actually, there are quite a few stories of our modern teachers. It really is very significant modern teachers. Mahasi Sayadaw was one. But there's this famous story I wanted to read to you that about the Dalai Lama. You've heard it before. Many of you have heard it before. But Sharon Salzberg asked the Dalai Lama about self-hatred and self-criticism. And here's what she wrote. She said, I went to Dharamsala, India in 1990 for a Mind and Life conference with the Dalai Lama. It was a small gathering of psychologists, scientists, and meditators exploring the topic of healing emotions. What do you think about self-hatred? I asked. The room went quiet as all of us awaited the answer of the Dalai Lama. Looking startled, he turned to his translator and asked pointedly in Tibetan again and again and again for an explanation. Finally, looking back at me, the Dalai Lama tilted his head, his eyes narrowed in confusion. Self-hatred, he repeated in English, as though trying out the words. What is that? I think that encapsulates much of what, this is Sharon talking, I think that encapsulates much of what we encounter as the teachings come from east to west. I don't want to deify Asian culture, but the rock-bottom belief that if we went to the core of our being, if we really knew who we were, it would be pretty bad news, doesn't seem to be there. Certainly not in the way it exists in the West. During the remainder of the session, the Dalai Lama repeatedly attempted to explore the contours of self-hatred with us. Is that some kind of nervous disorder? Are people like that very violent? He says, but you have Buddha nature. How could you think of yourself that way? At the end, he said, I thought I had a very good acquaintance with the mind, but now I feel quite ignorant. I find this very, very strange. Alan Wallace, who was there, said that the Buddha responded as though Sharon had said, all the people I teach have heads made of green cheese. The Dalai Lama just had no idea what she was talking about. And Mahasi Sayadaw had said something quite similar. He just kind of shook his head in a whole entirely different context. He said, that's a new one for me. He said, I never heard of that. I have no idea what you're talking about. So that this sense of really not taking the teachings and putting them in the context of the boundless heart is a foreign concept to many of our most significant spiritual teachers. So then we hear it and we go, well, yeah, sure, right. This is just how it is. And it's like, no. And the Dalai Lama is just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So with this self-criticism, I invited you all to listen to Pat's talk on challenging energies. And the hindrances that block this boundless heart, there are 5 hindrances. Craving says, I should be better than I am. Aversion says, I have failed again. Restlessness, I am afraid, tense, worrying that I won't meet standards, I won't be good enough. Doubt, I am no good, I'm bad, I can never change. Sloth, I am worthless, hopeless, impotent, I didn't quite make it, and I'm not likely to. Those are hindrances to the connection, not to the arising, but to our connection with our own inherent. The Dalai Lama says, don't they know they have Buddha nature? Don't they know their heart is boundless? Don't they know? Isn't that where they're starting from? And I'm saying, no, not really. Yeah. So these hindrances can take the form of this quality of self-criticism that then just keeps obscuring. And now we're trying to do our spiritual practices through them, and wondering why it's not working very well. This is Jack Engler. He says, the Enlightenment ideal itself can be cathected narcissistically as a version, the mother of all versions, of the grandiose self, as the acme of personal perfection with all mental defilements and fetters eradicated. the achievement of a purified state of complete self-sufficiency and personal purity from which all badness has been removed, which will be admired by others, and which will be invulnerable to further injury or disappointment. Perfection unconsciously comes to mean freedom from symptoms, so oneself will be superior to everyone else's, the object of their admiration, if not envy. I'll talk about this more when I talk about anger. Christina Feldman offers several questions. One, is whatever you're saying to yourself true? Really? Is it true? Is whatever you're saying to yourself helpful? Really? And is whatever you're saying to yourself rooted in love and kindness? Because if it's not part of your spiritual practice. So the practice, we did the exercise, we did it in our guided meditation, is to learn to to learn to really see what's there, and to greet it with that quality of acceptance, kindness, curiosity, letting go of some sense that this is evidence of my personal badness. But just being curious, what is this trying to accomplish? Maybe, if it's shame, maybe what it was trying to accomplish is to make sure we didn't get thrown out of the tribe. Thank you. Thank you. And maybe now as grown-ups, we have some more resources, some more strategies for working with it. I'll reach you a little over, but bear with me here. This is again from the Dalai Lama, and he's talking about, how might you rise to difficult situations without enmity, without criticism. And he's talking about patience. He says, this is no easy task, and those who are religiously minded must understand that here is no blessing or initiation, which, if only we could receive it, or any mysterious or magical formula or mantra or ritual, if only we could discover it, that can enable us to achieve transformation instantly. It comes little by little, just as a building is constructed brick by brick, or an ocean is formed drop by drop. Nor that what we are talking about here is the mere acquisition of knowledge. It is not even a question of developing the conviction that may come from such knowledge. What we are talking about is gaining an experience of virtue through constant practice and familiarization so that it becomes spontaneous. There are no shortcuts. May I be well and happy. May I consider my being precious. We're not praying that it comes true. What we're doing is we're directing our own minds to what is true. Let me say that again. So with a boundless heart, may I cherish all living beings, including myself. May I consider my being precious. May I always respect myself. May I be moved with compassion for all pain. May I know all difficulty as a sacred teacher. May I know my own boundless heart. We're not trying to put it into us. We are practicing drop by drop by drop, remembering that it's true. Very different thing. Very different thing. Okay. We're going to practice a little bit more with this the next time I teach, which is sometime or other. I think it might not be till August sometime. Anyway, last time I said it wrong, so I shouldn't say anything. Check the calendar. So blessings. Bye. I'm sorry? Oh, right. No. Yeah. Yes. Yes. The medication really is, so with a boundless heart may I cherish myself. That's the medication. Yeah. Blessings.